My name's Ed. I'm going to be talking about contributing a new AMP component. And this is based on my experience creating the amp-timeago component last year. So I'm going to talk through the process I went through, and hopefully it'd be helpful for you if you're looking to do something similar in terms of contributing a new component. But even if you're not, if you're just looking to get started in contributing to AMP in general, hopefully it'll still be helpful in maybe sort of explaining some of the architecture of AMP components and that kind of thing. I certainly think getting involved in AMP helped me become a better developer, just in the way the AMP project uses modern JavaScript patterns and also the design principles that were spoken about earlier. And whilst I was doing the development work for amp-timeago, I also found I got a lot of helpful feedback from the AMP team, and certainly learned a lot and was able to take a lot away from that. Okay, so just for some context, amp-timeago is a simple UI component that turns a date string into a fuzzy timestamp that's rendered on the page. So a common use case for this is on a news article where the publisher wants to display how many minutes or hours or maybe days it's been since an article was published. So you can see in the example here, it's displaying as 2 hours ago, and that's based on the date time attribute that's set when the component's added to the page. Okay, so just going back to creating a new component, and I guess the thing that starts with is an idea in terms of what are we looking to create. And at this point, I think it's worth just taking a step back and considering the best solution for implementing the functionality that we want to contribute to AMP. So it may be that existing tools can already do the job already for us. We might be able to piece together things like AMP bind, AMP events, along with some custom CSS to deliver the functionality that we want to contribute. For example, there's not like a combo box AMP component. But if you see here in the example that I've taken from the AMP by example website, we have a text box at the top with an event handler on it. And the text that's entered in there is then stored in AMP state. And then in the list below, AMP bind is then used to filter that list based on the value that's entered into the text box. And there's now quite a lot of quite advanced examples on amp-timeago demonstrating like how powerful the tools now are in AMP for building out things like this. Another approach we might take is that we decide actually, rather than creating a completely new component, the functionality that we want to add better lives in an existing component. For example, we might want to add share counts to articles, like the number of times an article has been shared on Facebook. And we could like create a new, completely new component for that, like called like AMP share count, something like that. Or we could merge the functionality into an existing component, like the AMP social share component that already exists. But we may decide that our idea is sufficiently different from everything that already exists and that a new component is the best solution. So where would we discuss all this? Well, the first place I would probably go would be the AMP Slack workspace and the contributing channel in there. And I think that's a great place just to get some initial feedback on the idea from other people in the AMP community. There's also the weekly design review meetings that Naina spoke about earlier. And they're, like she said, the video conferences that happen every Wednesdays, and everybody in the community is welcome to join those. So if we decided that a new component is definitely the best approach, that probably the first thing we'd do then would be to create an intent to implement issue. And I think this is actually one that my boss created last year and then handed it off to me to do the rest of the work. But this is where we can start like the initial dialogue about how the component should be architected. So for amp-timeago, we had to consider like how we would compute the fuzzy timestamps. So would we use like a third-party library like Moment.js, or would we like just implement completely our own solution for that? And also, like, how would we handle internationalization? So obviously, not everybody wants their timestamps displayed as English. And what we ended up doing is we used a third-party library called timeago.js, and because that's we found it to be super small, and it also has translations built into it. Anyway, this was all discussed in this initial intent to implement issue. And just a word on naming. All components should start with AMP. You probably know that already. And we should probably try and also ensure there's a bit of consistency. And we match like the conventions that are used by existing components. And that also applies to any like attributes that we'd use on our component. And the name of the component should obviously just accurately describe the functionality that the component provides. Okay, so once we've got to the point of deciding that we're creating a new component and we have an idea of how it should be architected, we can dive in and start writing some code. And this is kind of like the minimum file structure that we would need. So we have amp-timeago.js file, which is where most of our functionality should live. We have amp-timeago.md, so that's a markdown file for our documentation. Owners.yaml, where a list of maintainers for the component should be listed. A validator file at the bottom, and we'll talk about have the validation rules for the component in it. We'll look at that a bit later. And then at the top also a folder where our test would live. So we'll start off by looking at the main component file. And there's a class in AMP called amp.baseElement. And we'll nearly always want to extend this to create a new class for our component. And in this class, we'll define instance variables that we'll be using, and also overrides of AMP's component lifecycle methods. So if you look here, by extending amp.baseElement, we create a new class with the name matching the name of our component. So in our case, amp-timeago. And then the first thing we do inside here is create a constructor, which is always required when we create a new class. And you see at the top of here, first thing inside the constructor, is that we call super on the element. And that really just creates an initial element for us based off of the one that's provided by the base class. And that would then allow us to define the instance variables below in this top section in the constructor. And then beneath here is where we would implement the overrides of AMP's component lifecycle methods. So build callback is one of these. And we probably implement several kind of overrides at this point in the file. One thing I'd just say at this point, if you are familiar with this style of programming, like using classes, then that's great and you'll be right at home. But if you're not, then don't be put off, because that's kind of where I was when I started developing amp-timeago. And there's lots of examples and documentation and support available from the AMP team. And I think it's also a great opportunity to kind of learn and develop your programming skills. So just going back to our constructor, like I said, the first thing we do is call super on the element. And then this is when we define our instance variables. And we do need to specify a type for each of these. So you see in this example here, we've got a string, an element, and a Boolean. For the time element, which is set as being an element type, the question mark ahead of it just says that it can also be set to null, as this one is initially. Okay, so once that's done, we can then implement overrides of AMP's component lifecycle methods. And there's actually 12 of these that we can use. These are all defined in the amp.baseElement class, and they're set up for subclasses like our timeago class to override. So you might be relieved now. I'm not going to go through all 12 of these today, but we are going to look at the 5 that are in bold here, which I think the ones that we're most likely to use. They are all documented online, so you're free to go and read up on the others. So the first one we'll look at is the build callback. And this is where we do, this is almost always used, and it's where we do the initial setup work for our component. We can read in any attribute values. So in the case of timeago, we have the date time, the locale attributes of the other components, use things like width and height, that kind of thing. And it's also where we create the initial DOM structure for the element when it's going to be rendered out onto the page. Everything done here should be fast, so we shouldn't do any heavy work or network requests. So example here from amp-timeago of the build callback. So yeah, we read in the attributes, so like the date time and the locale. We then create a time element, just using regular JavaScript document.create element. We set the date time attribute on it, and then we call a method that we have in the amp-timeago component called set timestamp value. What that does is then just computes the fuzzy timestamp value that will be displayed to the user, and then this time element is then appended back to the amp-timeago element. Okay, next one to look at, the Preconnect Callback. And if we plan to load like resources from another domain, we can pre-connect to it at this point, and just do the initial handshake with the host so that things should load and download faster later on. And we can see an example of this from, we don't use this in amp-timeago, but an example here from the amp-Vimeo component, where we pre-connect to these domains because we're likely to download stuff from them later on. The layout callback is another one. And in terms of when this gets called, it's just determined by lazy loading logic in AMP. And that's based around how far the component is from the viewport, the user scrolling direction, how fast they're scrolling, that kind of thing. And this is what's often used to render out the final version of the element. So if we were loading a video or an iframe or something like that, this is where we would do it. So this example is taken from amp-gist, which goes off and gets a gist from GitHub as an iframe. We then append this to the element. And then for this element, we do need to return a promise, which should resolve when the element is laid out. And often we can just, for this, we can make use of the load promise method. That's a kind of helper method provided by AMP, and that will resolve when the element that's passed into it has been loaded. So this should resolve when the iframe is loaded. The unlayout callback is the next one to look at. This is called when an element is no longer laid out on the page. So example, if we put a component inside a tab on a page, and then the user moved to a different tab, this layout would be called, and it's a good point at which we should unload any heavy resources, like iframes, video, that kind of thing. So an example here, pretty simple, just if there is an iframe, it then removes that element, and then we should normally return true if we override this lifecycle method, because that just tells AMP that if the component does, or the element does come back to being active again on the page, then it should like relay it out again for us. Okay, and then finally, the viewport callback, and this is called when a component goes like in or out of view on the page. And the in viewport parameter is a Boolean, which should be either true or false. And just if it's true, the component's going into view in the page. If it's false, it's going out of view. So this is quite often used for like pausing or resuming video. We use it slightly differently in amp-timeago. What we do here is if a timeago element goes out of view and then back into view, we then recall our set fuzzy timestamp value method, which just updates the fuzzy timestamp so that it's up to date for the user. Okay, so that's the 5 lifecycle methods covered. And then just one final thing to mention for our main component file is that we do have to register the component. So we can use amp.registerElement method for this, and we just pass in the name of our extension, amp-timeago, the name of our class, also amp-timeago. And if we did want to include any CSS, we could import this from the build directory and then just pass this in as a third parameter when we call it amp.registerElement. Okay, so once we've written the code that creates our component, we do need to also write a few tests. And we should try and add as complete coverage, test coverage as we can for the functionality that our component provides. The AMP uses the Mocha framework and the Karma test runner. And so you may well be familiar with these already. We don't need to run the entire test suite during our development. We can just specify it to run just for our component. We can also pass in the watch flag, which just keeps the test running in the background, which is quite useful for us when we're doing our development. So we can look at some examples of this, and we can, this is all taken from amp-timeago, so we can do a before each function, which should run before each of our tests would run. So in amp-timeago, we always want to create a amp-timeago element. We always want to set these attributes, and we always want to then append the element to the document body. And just to use look at a couple of examples, the actual tests. This one creates a date object. It's then set to being 2 days ago, and then we then set the date time attribute on the timeago element to being the ISO string of that date. We set the text content to be a stringify version of the date. We build the timeago element, and then we do a query selector on the time element, which is inside the amp-timeago element, and then we just check that that text content now equals to 2 days ago. Another one, quite similar, but this just checks the functionality that we do on the Viewport callback. Again, very similar. We create a date object. This time we set it to being 10 seconds ago. Again, we set the date time attribute, set the text content, build the element. Then we wait for 1 second, and then we kind of fake a Viewport callback, and then we do a query selector on the time element and check that that now equals to 11 seconds ago. On to validation, and this is actually one of the more tedious parts, I have to admit, I found of creating an AMP component, but it's also really important because it's what enables the AMP validator to check that our component's being used in a way that's AMP valid. So we check things like that the correct attributes are being used, so that any mandatory ones are present, and that they're being used and the values being used for them are valid. Also, it would check that the layout that's being set is supported by a component, and that also that it's not being used on being used on the appropriate place on the page. So there are sometimes some restrictions around that. So this is a bit of a simplified version, just because of the room I had to put it on the slide. But this is a proto ASCII file, which is where we would set the validation rules for our component. So we would actually normally put in all the attributes in this file that are used by a component. Just because of space, I've just included the date time attribute here, and you see that that's being set as mandatory true. So it always has to be used by set by the user, and also a regex value. So the value that the user puts in should always match this regular expression. At the bottom, we've got the supported layout. So amp-timeago supports fixed height, and responsive. If we weren't sure which layouts our component should support, we can check that with the AMP team. All right, so the final thing we need to do is just add some documentation. And this is all set in the markdown file, so in our case, amp-timeago.md. And we should try and ensure that this file is as accurate as it can be and contains some examples, because the more helpful and well-written our documentation is, the more likely it will be for other developers to use our component. And all of the content of this markdown file is pulled in and displayed on the AMP reference AMP reference pages on ampproject.org. And that's often the first thing that comes up in Google. If you search for amp-timeago in Google, this is the first page that you get to. So it's really important from that point of view as well. OK, so once that's all done, we can submit a pull request. This is just like any other that we'd make for a contribution to AMP. Like Aaron just went through, it's the same process if we're creating a new component. And we'd create a pull request, something like this. We just briefly summarize the work that's been done. And we should also link back to the initial intent to implement issue that we saw earlier. We are like, after we submitted the pull request, we are likely to get some feedback, and we should try and be receptive as that. If code changes are requested, then it may not be that we've done anything wrong, but it just might be that the maintainers are trying to ensure that there's a consistent code style throughout the AMP project. But once the pull request is approved, it'll be merged into the master branch. We don't need to do anything more in terms of that. The AMP team will incorporate it into their next releases, so we can let the AMP team take care of that. But we should provide some post-launch support, like any open source project. Post-launch maintenance to contributions is important. Developers will start using our component, and they'll be likely to raise bugs, feature requests, and ask questions. So we should be prepared to support our component, especially for the first few months when the most activity occurs. And once our component is done, we should also make sure that it's easy for other people to find. So we should tell other people about it. We can tweet or blog about it, ask the AMP team to tweet about it or retweet our tweet. And we should also create an example to go on the AMP by example website. And to do this, we just create a pull request. It's in a separate repository, but it's also still under AMP project on GitHub. And even if we didn't decide to create a completely new component, if we went down one of the other routes that we spoke about earlier in terms of either extending functionality of an existing component or piecing together existing tools to create something new, we still submit an example to AMP by example, and it's great to see so many interesting examples now on this site. So just to finish up, just to say that amp-timeago was merged in just over a year ago. It's now used on a number of sites, including USA Today, The Independent, and the Evening Standard. And I think WordPress are now incorporating it into their Gutenberg setup as well. So it's nice to know that something that you've created is being used by others. And I hope some of you can go away and create some new components that the whole AMP community can benefit from. OK, thank you.